Hello, Rabbi.
Hello, Dave. How are you?
I'm thanking you.
Baruch.
Shana Tova and all the best.
Amar Chasima Tova to you and yours.
Thank you.
Can you see me, or is it too bright or too dark?
Let's have a look. A bit too bright in your background, yes.
Hello, Rabbi. Hello, David.
Hello, John.
Hello,
Shana
John.
Tova. How was Rosh Hashanah for everybody?
Very nice. Thank you. And yourself?
I worked twice as hard for half the people.
Shame.
Yes. Well, but the prospect.
Two shifts one day and 3 shifts the next day. Thank God Yom Kippur will manage with one.
Yeah.
Yes. Rita and I were in the Seif Hall with Rabbi Stern in the middle of the morning, 10:15, 10:45.
That was the first day. I was in the Seif Hall the second day.
Yeah.
So we swapped.
Yes.
I'm going to be right back. I'm just getting some water to keep me lubricated. Give me a minute.
I'll do the same.
Hello, Dave.
Hello, how are you doing?
Are you all right? And you?
Fine, thank you.
Man.
Shana Tova. And
No, to you too, man.
How you, Dennis?
All right, and you?
Good, thanks.
Good, man.
You have a good yontif.
it has been, yes.
Yeah.
Good.
Oh, fuck, I don't know.
Where's the Rebbe?
I know. Nobody.
He's going to get some water to drink.
Gone a long way.
He's got a big house.
Yes, Dave.
I've been there a few times.
Okay.
Oh,
Oh, do you go to that, the Sydenham Shul, Dave?
Yes.
Okay.
We were there on the first morning.
Yeah.
oh, God.
We were lucky to also go to our daughter the night before for supper, the first time since Pesach.
Oh, nice.
And when the rabbi's back, I'll make a small personal announcement.
Okay.
If nobody minds.
Not at all.
It's for information, not blowing my own trumpet or shofar.
Okay, sorry for keeping you.
Rabbi, do you mind if I make a small announcement?
What is that?
Today is the 7th of Tishrei, my Hebrew birthday.
Oh, okay. Mazel tov, Dave. Many happy, healthy returns.
Thank you.
Brother Rita. So
Thank
today's
you.
share is in honor of Dave Seith's birthday.
Oh, thank you very much.
Okay, but you should have invited your friends. Maybe we'd have a minion. Okay, we got a quality crowd, so let's go.
Yeah.
So apologies, but last week I couldn't make it because it was Erev Yontif and hectic. Hello, Kent. Gemar Chatima Tova to everybody. Well over the fast. Shana Tova.
Everyone,
Thank you.
yeah.
And
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm here this week. Next week, I'm actually going to be traveling to Cape Town on Monday. I'm going to Cape Town for Sukkot, so I'll either try and get another rabbi to replace me next Monday, or we'll send a link. So just giving you some advance notice. So you're already on chapter 4 of Shemitah, and as you already know, this year is in fact a Shemitah year. Shemitah means the sabbatical, if you haven't been around the last few days. The 7th year in the Jewish calendar cycle is called Shemitah, which means a sabbatical year when the land is supposed to rest. Just as we rest every 7th day, the land of Israel is meant to rest every 7th year. And we're not to plant and sow or harvest in the 7th year. So the Bible asks the question, V'chitomru ma nochal? And should you say, well, what are we going to eat? If we can't plant and harvest, we'll starve. It was an agricultural society in those days. So Hashem promises in the Chumash, in the Torah, that I will give you a bumper crop in the 6th year that will last you through the 7th year and into the 8th year in time for the harvest of the first part of the 8th year. So it's not 3 years that bumper crop of the 6th year will last, but 3 years apart thereof. Okay, so it's the end of the 6th, all of the 7th, and the beginning of the 8th, which will be enough to sustain the nation just from the last harvest of the 6th year. So that's quite a promise. In fact, the rabbis say that this is actually a very strong, powerful, logical proof of the divine origin of the Torah. You know, we have cynics who say the Torah was made up by Moses. Moses was a prince of Egypt. He was clever and sophisticated growing up in the palace. He took this rabble of slaves who were primitive and ignorant and unsophisticated, and he sold them a whole story, you know. The Torah is made up by Moses. So say some Bible critics, or call them for what they are, cynics. Here's a powerful proof. If Moshe was the author of the Bible, he would have to be mad. He would have to be suicidal to make a promise he could never hope to keep. How could he make a promise that the 6th year, every year, is going to be a bumper crop to last you till the 8th year? As soon as it's not a bumper crop, they'll lynch him. How could any human being make such a preposterous promise? The answer is that only Hashem could make such a promise, and therefore it's a very logical argument to show that the Torah is in fact not written by Moses, but just dictated by Moses from the Word of God. So I asked in the little reminder earlier in the WhatsApp group, so what are Israelis eating this year? It's now the 7th year, the sabbatical year in Israel. What are they eating? So I'm going to keep you in suspense because we'll get to that at the very end of the chapter. Stay tuned. Number 1, all produce that grows from the earth in the sabbatical year, whether it grew from seeds that fell into the earth before the sabbatical year, grew from roots whose plants were harvested previously but never grew again. In other words, you didn't plant it in the 7th year. Things are coming out on their own. In both instances, such produce is referred to as safiach, or grasses and vegetables that grew on their own accord in the sabbatical year. And by scriptural law, by biblical law strictly, they are permissible to be eaten. However, the rabbis said not so fast. Why? Because, number 2, because of the transgressors, so that they could not go and sow grain, beans, and garden vegetables in one's field discreetly at night when nobody's looking. And then when they grow, they'll partake of them, arguing that these are sfichim, they grew on their own. Therefore, because there would be, they knew there were in those times people who were likely to do such a things. Therefore, the sages prohibited all the sfichim that grow on their own in the sabbatical year. So by biblical law, it's permissible, but the rabbis forbade it because it could be abused by the less than scrupulous people. Number 3, so we have learned that the only produce of the sabbatical year of which one may partake are fruit from trees and herbs that are not sown by most people. Example, rue, amaranth. Anybody know what those are? Michelle, do you ever use that in the kitchen? What is rue and amaranth? I haven't got a clue.
Amaranth, I think, is oranges, citrus.
Really?
I think so.
Interesting. But it says that are not sown by most people. It sounds like it's a herb. Anyway, with regard to vegetables that most people sow in their gardens and species of grains and beans, by contrast, anything that grows from these species is forbidden according to rabbinic decree. One who gathers them is liable for stripes for rebellious conduct. You know what stripes are?
Lashes.
Whipping, lashes, malchus. It's a nice euphemism, eh? Stripes. Sounds like you're putting on tefillin or something. 4, when sfichim grow in an underdeveloped field, a field that was plowed, a vineyard, and a field where crops had been sown, they are permitted to be eaten. So, because there it doesn't, so he explains. Why so? Because a person will not sow these fields, so we don't have to worry about the unscrupulous people to exploit the law. When a field has been plowed, the owner desires it remain lying fallow. With regard to a vineyard, no person will cause his vineyard to become forbidden. When a field has been sown, the aftergrowth will spoil it. Similarly, straw that grows in the sabbatical year is permitted in all places. No decree was issued against its use as far as straw is concerned. So there's a whole science of the sabbatical year. I don't know if any of my colleagues have spoken about this in the first 3 chapters, but there is a logic that the land needs to lie fallow every 7th year for the land itself to nurture itself and to be able to rejuvenate itself, to be able to keep producing. And if you keep planting nonstop without giving the land a rest, it could get tired like we get tired, you know? So we need every 7th day, we need a Shabbos to take a rest, physically and spiritually. So too does a land need it. And okay, we'll talk about practical in Israel at the end. 5, when sfichim from the sabbatical year entered the following year, so it grew by itself in the sabbatical year. We said, the rabbi said you should not eat it in the sabbatical year, but now what if it's growing in the 8th year? So he says they're still forbidden. We may not uproot them by hand. Rather, one should plow the land like normal or let the animals pasture in ordinary fashion. 6, until when? How long do you have to wait? Until when are they forbidden in the 8th year? From Rosh Hashanah until Chanukah. Okay, so Hanukkah is usually what, December time, the 25th of Kislev. So you have Tishrei, Cheshvan, Kislev. So you have less than 3 months, first quarter of the year. When a person sows the sfichin of the sabbatical year, after the sabbatical year, the produce that grows from this is permissible. Lots of talk about onions in this chapter. Don't cry when we talk about it, okay? When onions of the sabbatical year enter the 8th year, they are permitted when there is enough time for produce of that size to have grown in the 8th year. If not, they are forbidden. Similar concepts apply with regard to other produce. They should not be purchased in the 8th year until produce of that size could have grown in the 8th year. Like if in the beginning of the 8th year and somebody's selling you ripe tomatoes, potatoes, whatever it is, say, hey, did this grow to this size in the 8th year? That seems a bit not actually plausible. So this might be from the 7th year. You're actually selling me forbidden stuff. So you have to be careful with what you buy. They should not be purchased in the 8th year until produce of that size could have grown in the 8th year. When in the 8th year, the produce which grows rapidly reaches the size of the produce, the prohibition is lifted from the produce that remains. So some things grow more quickly than others. I'm not a farmer, so I couldn't tell you what those are. It is permitted to purchase garden vegetables in the 8th year immediately. I guess they take quicker. When is a person permitted to purchase wild onions in the 8th year? When the new produce exceeds the old. Let's see what that means exactly. Let me just run down to number 27, see what he says here. Sorry for this. This refers to after Pesach. So when is that? After Pesach. Okay, that's like half the year. The first of Tishrei. Okay, so now there's a book of Talmud called Rosh Hashanah. I don't know if you're familiar with it. And the first Mishnah in the book of Talmud, Rosh Hashanah, says Arbo Rosh Hashanah. There are actually 4 Rosh Hashanahs. Really? What other Rosh Hashanahs do you know about, guys? Besides the one we just had last week?
There's a Rosh Hashanah of trees.
Thank you very much. Tu B'Shvat is Rosh
Tu B'Shvat.
Hashanah Le'ilanot, the new year for trees. There are also 2 other Rosh Hashanahs by which we count different things. So there's the calendar year, there's the trees, but there's also, for example, the reign of kings was counted from, I think from the 1st of Nisan, I'm not sure. But there are other areas like tithing and such, which count by a different, not necessarily by the Rosh Hashanah that we celebrate. So there's actually 4 Rosh Hashanahs in the year. The first of Tishrei is Rosh Hashanah, not only with regard to our calendar, but also with regard to the sabbatical and the Jubilee years. Those are counted from Rosh Hashanah. Skip the bracket. Even though they are gathered in the sabbatical year, they are considered like produce of the 6th year in all regards. Sorry, that's produce of the 6th year that entered the sabbatical year. Grains, legumes, or fruit that reach the stage when tithes are required to be separated, which is 1/3 of the growth, by the way, before Rosh Hashanah, are permitted to be reaped. So if they grew to 1/3 before the sabbatical year, it's okay. Even if they're gathered in the sabbatical year, they're considered produce of the 6th year. 10, grain and legumes are forbidden to be eaten as sfichin, and the fruit of trees must be eaten with consideration for the holiness of the sabbatical year. Number 10. Let me just see what 33 has to tell us. Sorry for this. And harvested. Hmm. 34, sorry about that. Wrong one. Don't look if it boggles your eyes. Hi, sheep seed chapters 5. Okay, I didn't get anything from that. I just apologies. Okay. 11. When rice, millet, poppy seed, sesame seed, Egyptian beans are sown to produce seed. Okay, so this is a difference now. Is it produced for eating or is it produced for seed? If it's for seed, if it's sown to produce seed rather than to eat, the law is different. So he says, then the ruling depends on when the produce completes its growth. If its growth is completed before Rosh Hashanah, these seeds are permitted to be harvested in the sabbatical year. If their growth is completed after Rosh Hashanah, it's forbidden. The ruling regarding vegetables depends on the time they were harvested. With regard to an esrog, hey, okay, it's time to start thinking about buying an esrog already. You don't have, there's a fallacy that you have to wait till after Yom Kippur to build a sukkah or buy an esrog. That's a total fallacy. There's no truth in it. You can buy an esrog today. You can build a sukkah today. You could even do it before Rosh Hashanah. With regard to an esrog, even if it was the size of a bean before Rosh Hashanah, now obviously an esrog is much bigger than a little bean, so it's just starting to grow. It's the size of a bean. And grew to the size of a loaf of bread. A loaf of bread, that's much bigger. That's quite a big esrog, a loaf of bread, eh? In the sabbatical year, it is obligated to be tithed like the produce of the 6th year because it already had a certain significant basic minimum size of a bean in the 6th year. Conversely, even if that reached the size of a loaf of bread in the 6th year, since it was reaped in the sabbatical year, it is considered produce of the sabbatical year. As a stringency, the tithes are separated like the produce of the 6th year. Okay, that's a law of tithing, not so much about the sabbatical. 13. Similarly, when the produce of the sabbatical year is reaped in the 8th year, with regard to grain, legumes, and fruit of the trees, it really depends on when the produce reaches a stage when tithes are regarded to be separate, which we said before was a third of the size. When rice, millet, poppy seeds, and produce seed, when the produce completes its growth, a third is not enough, it has to be completed. When one sowed Egyptian beans for seed, not for eating, but for seed in the 6th year, and the produce was completed before Rosh Hashanah of the sabbatical year, both its vegetable seeds are permitted in the sabbatical year. If one sowed it to use as the vegetable to eat it, and at the end of the sabbatical year, both its vegetable seeds are forbidden. Similarly, if he sowed it both for seed and vegetable, likewise forbidden. 15. If one transgressed and sowed such beans in the sabbatical year, and they completed to grow in the sabbatical year, but they remained in the ground until the 8th year, if they were sown for seed, then both the seed and the vegetables are forbidden in the 8th year, like other sfichin. If one sowed it to use as a vegetable, since it was harvested in the 8th year, then it's permissible. If you sowed it both for seed and vegetable, it's forbidden. Then for seed it's forbidden, and for vegetables it's permitted. 16, white figs. Did you know that white figs take 3 years before their growth is completed? You know the difference between white figs and other figs? Do fig farmers practice apartheid?
I didn't know there was such a thing as a white fig.
Since white figs take 3 years before their growth is completed, if they reach the stage when tithes are required to be separated before Rosh Hashanah of the 8th year, they should be eaten in the 2nd year of the 7-year cycle, according to the restrictions governing food of the sabbatical year. Onions, back to onions. Onions that will not produce scallions. What are scallions?
It's also a kind of onion.
Isn't it a red onion?
Could be, yes, could be.
Scallions are used in my mother of blessed memory used to talk about scallions. She used scallions. I don't think they call them. I don't think they call them here. I think they call them spring onions there.
No, spring onions are
Scallions are spring onions.
the spring onions are the tops of the onions, the green shoots.
Onions
Above.
that will not produce scallions, and Egyptian beans from which water was withheld for 30 days before Rosh Hashanah. Onions that do produce scallions, which water was over 3 irrigation periods before Rosh Hashanah, are considered as the produce of the 6th year. If water was withheld from them for a shorter period, then considers as sfichin of the sabbatical year. So if it's for the 6th year, you can use it. It's the 7th, you cannot. 18. Gourd plants, that's like cabbages, right? Which were maintained in the ground to produce seed. If they became hard before Rosh Hashanah and thus were unfit for human consumption, it is permitted to maintain them a sabbatical year because they are from the produce of the 6th year. If not, they are considered as sfichin from the sabbatical year. Similarly, with regard to other vegetables, any ones that become hard before Rosh Hashanah are permitted to be maintained in the sabbatical year. If they were soft, it's forbidden. We do not require a person to uproot wild onions. If they grow on their own, they're wild. Instead, we allow them to leave them in the ground as they are. If they grow in the 8th year, they are permitted. Similarly, we do not require them to uproot an artichoke plant. All that is necessary is to cut off its leaves. If it grows again in the 8th year, it's permitted. Wild onions grown in the 6th year, summer onions and madder. What's madder? Who knows?
I think it's I think I've heard it referred to as like a feed, cattle feed, madder.
Okay. Which completed their growth before the sabbatical year may be uprooted in the sabbatical year with metal hatchets, and that's not considered tilling the land because they started growing in the 6th year. 20. When in the sabbatical year rain descended upon onions and they sprouted leaves, the leaves are permitted as long as they are light green. If they're turned dark, it's considered that the plants were planted in the earth. Excuse me, and those leaves are forbidden as sfichin. In both situations, the onions themselves remain permitted. When an onion was uprooted in the sabbatical year and replanted in the 8th year, and its growth now exceeds its original size, the original growth elevates the original mass, and the whole onion is now permitted. The rationale being that since the prohibition of the sabbatical year comes about via the earth, it can also be removed via the earth. So the same earth that prohibited now allowed it. It was sort of nullified by the greater growth in the 8th year. 22, fruits produced by a tree in the sabbatical year should not be reaped in the same manner as they are reaped every year. So we said before that fruits that grow by themselves may be used in the sabbatical year, but now he's adding a condition that you should not reap them in the same manner, in the same style as you would normally. So the verse says, in Vayikra, the grapes you had designated you shall not gather. One who reaps grapes to improve the vine, or in the ordinary manner of reaping, is liable for lashes, not stripes, lashes, real lashes. How should one conduct themselves? Meaning, what should you do differently? So he says as follows. Figs of the sabbatical year, which normally you'd have a whole special area to lay out the figs to dry, should not be set out to dry in the place where they usually are. They can, however, be left to dry in a ruin or somewhere else. We may not crush grapes in a vat like we normally would, but they may be crushed in a kneading trough. So you're doing it, but you're doing it in a different fashion, which makes it permissible. Olives should not be crushed in a press, but may be squeezed and placed in a very small press. One may grind them in the oil press and place them in a small press. Similarly, with regard to other matters, The basic rule is one should deviate from the norm in whatever way possible. Things that may be reaped on the sabbatical year, do it in a different manner than you would normally do it in the other 6 years. 24, it is a positive commandment to divest oneself from everything the land produced in the sabbatical year. The verse in Exodus, V'hashviyas tishmetena unetashta, in the 7th year you shall leave it untended and unharvested, which means that you are the farmer. Whatever grows by itself, it's yours the same as it's someone else's. The poor have a right to come into your private property and pick stuff, and you cannot stop them. You can also pick for yourself, but the same as the public. Anyone who locks his vineyard and fences off his field in the sabbatical year has nullified a positive commandment. This also holds true if he gathered all his produce into his home, so no one else should get it. Instead, he should leave everything as if it were ownerless. Thus, everyone has equal rights in every place, the public and the owner equally. As it says, and the poor of your people shall partake of it. One may bring a small amount in one's home, just as one brings from ownerless property. The same as the poor can collect, you can collect, but you can't go fill up the whole house so no one else can get anything. For example, 5 jugs of oil, 15 jugs of wine, more than that. If he takes more than that, it's permitted, but he shouldn't do it. 25. Okay, now we're getting to some of the practicalities. So here in South Africa, it's the sabbatical year. Do we have to worry about stuff that's grown in the Cape?
No.
So the laws apply only to Eretz Yisrael. Ki tavo'u el haaretz, when you come to the land, the promised land, Israel. And furthermore, it's only observed while the temple is, it is observed while the temple is standing, meaning while the temple is in existence, and also when it's not in existence, meaning today. We don't have the temple in Jerusalem, sadly, but the laws of the sabbatical still apply in the land of Israel. Now, there were some neighboring lands of Israel, which the rabbis ruled should have the same law as Israel in the olden days. In the entire area taken possession of by the Jews who ascended from Babylonia until Kziv, don't ask me where Kziv is today, I'm not sure. It's forbidden to work the land, and the sfichen that grow there are forbidden to be eaten. In the entire area was taken possession of only by the Jews that ascended from Egypt, from Kziv to the river of Egypt, and to the Umanum Mountains. What are the Umanum Mountains? Let's see, 94. A mountain range in northern Lebanon, which represents the boundaries of the land conquered by the Jews after the exit from Egypt. As the Rambam explains, our sages imposed certain restrictions in this land as well, even though it's not Israel proper, but because it's bordering. So there one may till the land in the sabbatical year. So the first area you may not, the second area you may. Syria, according to scriptural law, is not Israel. But the sages decreed that it's forbidden to till the land, even if because if the Jews conquered it, it's still not the Holy Land. Jews could conquer land which is outside of the biblical borders of Israel. By the way, is Eilat part of the Holy Land?
No.
So many people say no, which means that in Eilat they should actually keep 2 days Yom Tov on Sukkot. But I don't know too many people that do. So there are different opinions, and I know a handful of rabbis who are strict and keep 2 days, but most people don't. But here's so that they conquered parts of Syria. The rabbis decree that it would be forbidden to till the sabbatical like Israel, Why? Because if you could use the land in the 7th year in Syria, which is just up the road from Israel, that would encourage emigration. Yirida. You'd have a bunch of people moving to Syria so they wouldn't have to worry about the sabbatical year restrictions. So to prevent that from happening, the rabbis didn't want them to abandon Israel and go and settle permanently there. So they said that the sabbatical year will apply in Syria too. Ammon, Moab, Egypt, and Babylon, by contrast, which are further away, though they ruled that tithing should be done there by rabbinic law, the sabbatical year is not observed. Transjordan, it is observed by rabbinic decree. It's just across the Jordan River, right? You could swim there. We took in our last Sidnam Shul tour of Israel, we went to a spot by the Jordan River, and we could see the Jordanian guard on the other side of the river. It was a very narrow point over there of the river. He was busy reading the newspapers. He didn't seem too interested in us. Sabbatical year is observed in Transjordan by rabbinic decree. The sficha of Syria and Israel are permitted to be eaten. The restrictions of these lands need not be more stringent than those portions of Eretz Yisrael that were inhabited by the people ascending from Egypt. Okay, now, here, this is very interesting, and this is relevant to right now. I asked in the teaser, what will Israelis eat this year? Well, they could eat meat and chicken and fish and cheese and eggs, but what about fruit and vegetables, which grow from the land? So here's one clue, 29. When a Gentile purchases land in Eretz Yisrael and sows it in the sabbatical year, the produce is permitted. Our sages decree that sfichin should be forbidden only as a safeguard against transgressors. The Gentiles are not commanded to observe the Shemitah year, so we're not worried about, we don't have to make any special arguments for them. So, in Israel today, now let me just finish number 30 and then I'll tell you a little bit about it. In the cities of Israel that are close to the border, we appoint a trustworthy watchman so that the Gentiles will not spread through the land and take the produce of the sabbatical year. Now let me tell you about the practicalities. Okay, so practically speaking, one solution we see here is that Israelis could buy fruit and vegetables from Arabs. They can go to the Arab shuk and buy to their heart's content. The Israeli chief rabbinate at the beginning of the state came up with a legal loophole, a little bit like chometz on Pesach. If you have a case of Black Label in your cupboard, in your bar, you can't clean it out before Pesach. Even if you like to drink, you can't finish a whole case of whiskey. So what are you going to do with it? So we have the option to sell the chometz, right? We lock it up or close the cupboard or cover it, and we sell the chometz to a non-Jew, and after Pesach, we buy it back. So it's not in our possession, so it's kosher. We haven't violated the commandment, and we're allowed to partake of it after Pesach. So the chief rabbinate in Israel came up with a somewhat controversial legal loophole, and that is selling the whole land. They sell the land to a goy. So it's all Gentile produce. In the more religious community, they're not happy with that loophole. And they will only purchase fruit and vegetables this year from non-Jewish vegetable purveyors. Maybe we should send them some Portuguese fruit guys. to Israel. So that's basically in a nutshell. There are those who rely on that loophole, and there are those who will taka only buy from Arabs, non-Jews, in the sabbatical year. What applies to us is not only if we travel to Israel, please God, we should be able to travel soon, but sometimes we here in South Africa get imported produce from Israel. I remember Woolworths had something called Israeli tomatoes. Then I looked on the back and I saw it said produce of South Africa. Israeli tomatoes was like a title. It's an Israeli style tomato, but it was actually made in South Africa, so there was no problem. But there are certain things that do come in from Israel from time to time, and you would have to be careful. You'd have to find out. If it's coming in now, then we can be pretty confident that it's from the 6th year, because the 7th year just started last week. Nothing has grown yet and been exported abroad from Israel in a week. So for the next little while, if something comes in, we can be pretty confident that it's from the 6th year. But say towards the middle of the year, we'd have to start being careful and asking for rabbinic guidance on what to do. Okay, guys, it's quite late, so I'm going to have to sign off. I wish you well over the fast, a Gemar Chatima Tova, Shana Tova Umetuka, and I probably will not be giving the shir next Monday. As I say, I'll be traveling, but stay tuned for either a stand-in rabbi or a link. Hopefully the following week I'll be able to. If not, the week after, I'll be back home in Joburg.
Enjoy
So,
Cape
Zach,
Town.
I wish you a meaningful Yom Kippur, and may all our prayers be answered.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Amen. Amen.
Amen.
Rabbi?
Please, Rabbi.
Rabbi?
Travel
Rabbi,
well.
just-
Bye.
Rabbi, just before we go,
Yeah.
while you were talking, I looked up on Farmer Google what amaranth is. I was wrong. It's not oranges. It's a plant that grows a beautiful, everlasting flower. The amaranth in myth is a deep red or purple, never fading flower and a symbol of immortality. In ancient Greece, the flower was thought to have special healing powers and was used to decorate images of the gods and tombs. And also it said it looks like spinach and it's like a distant relative, but it isn't spinach itself.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Dave.
Sei gesund,
Bye,
everybody.